The cold silence of the conference room shattered the moment Brenda walked in, her predator's smile fading when she saw Harry at the head of the table. This wasn't just an insurance meeting, it was a trap, carefully set by the man she thought she'd destroyed. And when Harry calmly told her, "I own the place," the Queen of Lake Winds realized her empire was nothing but sand. This is the story of how arrogance meets consequence. Watch until the end, hit like and subscribe for more stories of justice served, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. 6 months earlier, life for Harry was a symphony of simple, well-earned pleasures. At 62, he had traded the rigid timetables of a career as a master electrical engineer for the gentle, flowing rhythm of retirement. His days were his own, measured not by deadlines and schematics, but by the position of the sun in the sky and the happy panting of his golden retriever, Buster. His home, a modest but sturdy brick house he'd lived in for 30 years, was his sanctuary. But his soul, the very heart of his contentment, resided 15 miles away, on the quiet shore of Miller's Lake. The cabin wasn't just a building, it was a legacy. Built by his grandfather with timber felled from the very same plot of land, it was a testament to honest work and timeless skill. Every log, every stone in the massive fireplace held a story. Harry had spent his own life adding to that story, meticulously maintaining and upgrading the structure, running new, safe wiring where his grandfather's knob and tube had once been, and refinishing the wide plank floors until they shone with a deep, honeyed glow. It was a $2 million property on paper, sure, but to Harry, it was priceless. It smelled of pine and old wood smoke, and the rich, dark coffee he brewed every morning on the porch, watching the mist burn off the lake. Buster would lie at his feet, his tail thumping a soft beat against the weathered deck boards. This was peace. Real, tangible peace. He hadn't just worked for it. He'd engineered it, just as carefully as he would a high-voltage substation. He had no idea that a force of nature, far more destructive than any electrical surge, was gathering just over the manicured hedges of his own neighborhood. A storm named Brenda. The first sign of trouble arrived not with a thunderclap, but with the rustle of a high-quality linen blend envelope being pushed through his mail slot. It was from the Lakewinds Homeowners Association. Harry had coexisted with the HOA for 3 decades, with little more than an annual dues notice. But things had changed. A new president had been elected 6 months prior. A woman named Brenda, who seemed to view the neighborhood not as a community, but as her personal fiefdom to be ruled with an iron fist and a 3-ring binder full of bylaws. The letter was a formal citation. His mailbox, the very same sturdy, black-painted steel box that had stood by his curb since he moved in, was, according to Section 4, subsection C, paragraph 2, out of compliance with the approved community aesthetic standards. It was 1/2 inch too tall. Harry read the letter twice, a slow, incredulous smile spreading across his face. 1/2 inch. He walked outside, Buster trotting alongside him, and looked at the mailbox. Then he looked at the identical mailboxes of his neighbors. It was absurd. It felt less like a notice and more like a probe. A little test of his willingness to bow. Later that day, he saw her for the first time. A woman with a visor and a clipboard, marching down the sidewalk, occasionally stopping to make a note. She moved with the rigid posture of someone who believed they were perpetually in charge. When she passed his house, her eyes flicked to his mailbox, then to him, and she offered a thin, condescending smile before continuing her patrol. That was Brenda. And that little smile told Harry everything he needed to know. This wasn't about a mailbox. This was about power. And Harry, a man who had spent his life working with unforgiving forces like electricity, knew one thing for certain. You don't cede power to a bully, not even 1/2 inch. Harry, being a man of logic and process, decided to treat the mailbox citation as a problem to be solved, not a declaration of war. He drafted a polite, factual letter in response. He cited the mailbox's 30-year history, its conformity with all postal regulations, and the lack of any prior complaint. He even included a small, tongue-in-cheek diagram showing the 1/2 inch discrepancy, labeling it as being within a reasonable margin of error for ground settling over 3 decades. He sent it via certified mail, creating a paper trail. It was a clear, reasonable, and utterly pointless gesture. The response came a week later. It was another formal letter, this one colder in tone. His appeal was denied. He was now being fined $50 for the initial violation, plus an additional $10 per day until the non-compliant structure was rectified. The letter was signed by Brenda President. There was a smug finality to it, the bureaucratic equivalent of a slammed door. This, Harry realized, was not a negotiation. It was a command. He was being ordered to rip out a perfectly good mailbox, a piece of his home's history, over a triviality. The absurdity of it all was starting to curdle into a slow-burning anger. He thought of his father, a mechanic who always said, "Some folks aren't happy unless they're making someone else miserable." Brenda, it seemed, was one of those folks. The fine wasn't the point. It was the principle. It was about a petty tyrant using the fine print of a rulebook to exert control over another person's life. He looked out the window at the offending mailbox, standing there stoically. It was no longer just a mailbox. It was a line in the sand, and Brenda had just crossed it with a $50 fine and a whole lot of unearned arrogance. He wasn't going to just roll over. Not now. Not ever. His next-door neighbor, a sweet, elderly widow named Mrs. Gable, caught him while he was watering his petunias. She shuffled over to the fence line, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched her gardening trowel. "Harry," she whispered, her voice thin and worried. "I saw you got another letter." In a small community, secrets traveled fast. "It's nothing, Martha," Harry said, forcing a reassuring smile. "Just a little disagreement about my mailbox." Her eyes, clouded with age but sharp with wisdom, told him she knew better. "It's never just a little disagreement with her," she said, nodding her head toward Brenda's immaculate two-story colonial at the end of the cul-de-sac. "She's been president for less than a year, and she's run off 2 families. Fined the Millers into the ground over the color of their kid's swing set. Called the city on the Garcias because their dog barked when the mailman came." "Mrs." Gable leaned closer, her voice dropping even lower. "Be careful, Harry. She doesn't just want you to follow the rules. She wants you to break. She enjoys it." It was a chilling warning, delivered with the quiet terror of someone who had seen it all before. Mrs. Gable had lived in her house for 50 years. She was the neighborhood's unofficial historian, a repository of its triumphs and its petty squabbles. She had seen presidents come and go, but this one, she implied, was different. This one was venomous. Her fear was palpable. It was the fear of a person on a fixed income, who couldn't afford fines or legal battles, who just wanted to live out her days in peace. And it solidified something in Harry's mind. Brenda wasn't just a nuisance. She was a predator who preyed on the vulnerable. And Mrs. Gable's fear, more than any fine, made Harry more determined than ever to stand his ground. He wasn't just fighting for his mailbox anymore. He was fighting for the quiet dignity of his entire neighborhood. The fines kept coming. Each letter was a little masterpiece of passive-aggressive bureaucracy. The daily $10 penalty for the mailbox was soon joined by a $25 fine for his garden hose, which was apparently not coiled in a regulation manner. Then came a $50 citation, because a patch of clover had dared to sprout in his otherwise immaculate lawn, a violation of the Uniform Flora mandate. It was death by 1,000 paper cuts, each one designed to annoy, to frustrate, and to wear him down. Harry didn't pay a single one. Instead, he documented. He bought a small, high-resolution camera and started taking time-stamped photos. He photographed his perfectly coiled hose, the minuscule patch of clover, and, of course, the half-inch too-tall mailbox. He created a new binder, a counterpoint to Brenda's Bible of bylaws. His was a dossier of harassment. He scanned every letter, every threat, and filed it neatly. He started recording his interactions. When Brenda would happen to be walking by as he was doing yard work, making some snide comment, Harry would politely inform her she was being recorded for his records. The first time he did it, her condescending smirk evaporated, replaced by a flash of pure, unadulterated fury. She wasn't used to her targets having teeth. It was escalating into a silent, suburban Cold War. Her weapon was the rulebook. His was meticulous, irrefutable evidence. He knew this couldn't be solved with a polite letter. This was going to require a strategy. So he made a call to the one person he knew who loved a good fight as much as he loved a well-oiled machine. His old college roommate, Frank, who was now one of the sharpest litigation attorneys in the state. "Frank," he said, after explaining the situation, "I think my HOA president has decided to make me her personal project." Over the phone, he could almost hear Frank's predatory grin. "Oh, this sounds fun, Harry. This sounds very fun indeed." Frank's advice was simple and direct, much like the man himself. "Don't engage. Don't argue. Just document," he'd said over the phone. "Let her build the case against herself. People like this, they're arrogant. They think the rules don't apply to them, only to others. Sooner or later, her arrogance will make her sloppy, and when she gets sloppy, we'll be there to catch her." So Harry became a silent observer, a chronicler of Brenda's reign of terror. He set up a discreet security camera on his front porch, legally focused only on his own property, which happened to have a clear view of the sidewalk in front of his house. The footage was a revelation. It captured Brenda, making her daily patrols, clipboard in hand. It captured her slowing down as she passed his house, her eyes scanning his property like a hawk searching for prey. On one occasion, it even captured her kicking one of his decorative garden gnomes, then quickly looking around to see if anyone had noticed before scurrying away. It was so childish, so petty. It would have been laughable if it weren't so pathetic. He also started talking to his neighbors more, not to rally them, but just to listen. The stories poured out. Fines for leaving a child's bicycle on the driveway for an hour. A warning for having a non-approved welcome mat. A threat of legal action over holiday decorations that were left up 2 days past the January 15th deadline. Every story painted the same picture. A woman obsessed with control, who wielded her minor authority like a medieval scepter. The rallied community wasn't a cohesive force yet. They were a collection of isolated victims, too intimidated or weary to fight back on their own. But in every conversation, Harry saw a spark of shared frustration. The kindling was there. All it needed was a strong enough wind to ignite it. The war of attrition continued for weeks. Brenda, frustrated by Harry's silent defiance and meticulous record-keeping, started to change tactics. The letters became more personal, more accusatory. One citation for unattractive shrubbery came with a handwritten note at the bottom. "A man's yard is a reflection of his character. Your lack of care is bringing down the entire neighborhood." It was a direct attack, a psychological jab meant to sting. Harry just photographed it, filed it, and sent a copy to Frank. Frank's reply was a one-word email. "Beautiful." Brenda began a whispering campaign. At the community mailbox, she would engage other residents in conversations that Harry was just loud enough to overhear. "It's such a shame about Mr. Henderson," she'd say with a sigh of feigned concern. "He's just let his place go since he retired. I'm worried about him." She was trying to paint him as an unstable, defiant old man, a problem resident who was a threat to their property values. She was isolating him, trying to turn the court of public opinion against him. But her strategy was backfiring. The neighbors she was talking to were the same ones who had received their own ridiculous citations. They would nod politely to her face. But later, they would give Harry a sympathetic look or a quiet word of encouragement. One neighbor, Mr. Garcia, whose dog had been the subject of Brenda's wrath, stopped Harry by the curb. "Don't let her get to you," he said, his voice low. "She's a bully. We're all sick of her. We're just, you know." Harry knew. They were afraid. They had jobs to go to, kids to raise, and lives to live. They didn't have the time or the resources for a protracted war with a woman who seemed to have nothing but time on her hands. But Harry did. He had time, he had resources, and most importantly, he had a stubborn streak a mile wide. Brenda thought she was isolating him. In reality, she was making him a symbol. The focus of Brenda's obsession shifted abruptly when she found out about the lake cabin. It happened during the annual HOA community picnic, an event Brenda presided over with the grim efficiency of a drill sergeant. Harry, wanting to maintain a semblance of normalcy, had attended, bringing a bowl of his famous potato salad. He made small talk with another neighbor, mentioning he was heading up to his cabin the next day to do some fishing. Brenda, who had been hovering nearby, swooped in. "A cabin?" she asked, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet curiosity. "Where is this cabin?" Harry, sensing the shift in the wind, was intentionally vague. "Oh, up on Miller's Lake. Been in the family for generations." Brenda's eyes narrowed. "Miller's Lake," she repeated slowly, tasting the words. "That's a very exclusive area. Some of those properties have an impact on our community's watershed and view corridors. Is your property up to code?" The implication was clear. She was looking for a new front, a new battlefield where she could attack him. "It's not in your jurisdiction, Brenda," Harry said calmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. "It's private property, well outside the boundaries of Lake Winds." A flicker of rage crossed her face before being replaced by her usual condescending smile. "We'll see about that," she said, before turning on her heel and marching away. It was a declaration of war. She had been thwarted at his home, stymied by his cameras and his lawyer. Now, she had a new target. His sanctuary, the one place on earth he held sacred. And as he watched her storm off, a cold knot of dread formed in his stomach. He knew, with absolute certainty, that she would stop at nothing to hurt him. And the cabin was the perfect way to do it. The first attack on the cabin was, like all of Brenda's initial salvos, bureaucratic. She couldn't touch him with HOA bylaws, so she turned to county ordinances. A formal complaint was filed with the county planning department, alleging that Harry's boat dock was an unpermitted structure that violated shoreline regulations. The complaint was, of course, anonymous. Harry had to take a day off from his fishing to meet with a county inspector, a weary-looking man who seemed as annoyed by the situation as Harry was. Harry, ever prepared, had the original permits for the dock, signed and dated by the county in 1978. He also had his own detailed maintenance logs, showing every board he'd replaced and every bolt he'd tightened over the years. The inspector took one look at the pristine paperwork and the sturdy, well-maintained dock and sighed. "There's nothing wrong here, Mr. Henderson," he said, shaking his head. "Everything's perfectly in order. We've been getting a lot of these, let's call them frivolous complaints lately about properties on this lake, wasting a lot of our time." Harry knew exactly where they were coming from. He thanked the inspector, who officially dismissed the complaint on the spot. It was a victory, but a hollow one. It proved that Brenda was willing to expand her campaign of harassment far beyond the borders of their neighborhood. She was trying to bog him down in red tape, to make his life so full of administrative headaches that he would eventually give in just for some peace. But she was misjudging her opponent. Harry wasn't a man who was easily flustered by bureaucracy. He had dealt with government contracts and labyrinthine safety codes his entire life. To him, this was just another system to be navigated and, if necessary, defeated. He documented the entire incident, the complaint, the inspection, the dismissal, and added it to his growing file. Brenda had fired another shot, and she had missed, but he knew she wouldn't stop shooting. After the failed dock complaint, the harassment took a more direct and, frankly, more pathetic turn. The next weekend, Harry drove up to the cabin. He found the heavy chain that blocked his private access road had been cut. The padlock was lying in the dirt, clearly smashed with a rock. Nothing was taken. Nothing was vandalized at the cabin itself. It was just an act of violation, a message. "I can get to you here." Harry immediately called the sheriff's department. A deputy came out, took a report, but was frank with him. "Honestly, Mr. Henderson, without a witness or a camera, there's not much we can do. It's vandalism, but it's a low-priority case. Probably just some local kids." Harry knew it wasn't kids. Kids would have left beer cans or broken a window. This was clean. It was pointed. It was Brenda. But he had no proof. The deputy's visit, however, served a purpose. It created an official record. It was another piece of evidence in his binder, another documented incident in the escalating pattern of harassment. He bought the thickest, case-hardened steel chain he could find and a new, high-security padlock. As he was installing it, he felt a profound sense of anger. She was trespassing on his peace, forcing him to turn his sanctuary into a fortress. He also invested in a set of high-end, solar-powered, motion-activated trail cameras, the kind hunters use. He placed them discreetly along the access road, hidden in the dense foliage of the pines. If she, or anyone else, set foot on his property again, he would have them. He was an engineer, a man who believed in systems and data. From now on, anyone who approached his cabin would be entering a system of his own design, and he would have the data to prove it. The war had just gone high-tech. The trail cameras paid off sooner than he expected, not with a clear shot of Brenda, but with something almost as good, her car. A week after installing the cameras, he checked the SD cards. The footage was mostly deer and a very surprised-looking raccoon. But then, there it was, a time-stamped video from 2:14 a.m. on a Tuesday. A pristine, white luxury SUV, Brenda's car. He recognized it instantly, driving slowly past the entrance to his access road. It didn't stop. It didn't turn in. It just cruised past, its headlights cutting through the darkness, and then returned the way it came a few minutes later. On its own, it wasn't a crime. It was a public road. But in the context of everything else, it was damning. It was a late-night reconnaissance mission. It placed her at the scene. He called the police again, speaking with Detective Miller, a sharp, no-nonsense cop who had taken an interest in his case after the second or third report. Harry explained the history, the HOA disputes, the escalating harassment. He emailed him the video file. "It's not enough for a warrant, Harry," Miller said, his voice laced with frustration. "It's suspicious as hell, but it's not illegal to drive down a road. But keep this. Keep everything. This is how these cases are built. Brick by brick. Right now, you've got a good foundation." Harry felt a grim satisfaction. He wasn't just a victim anymore. He was a partner in the investigation of his own harassment. He was building the case, just as Miller said, brick by brick. He backed up the video file to 3 separate hard drives. It was his first truly solid piece of evidence connecting Brenda to the harassment at the cabin. He had her car, her license plate, and the time. It wasn't the smoking gun, but he could smell the gunpowder in the air. He knew she would be back. And next time, he'd be even more prepared. A few days later, the rallied community finally began to stir from its slumber, thanks to Mrs. Gable. She called Harry, her voice a mixture of fear and righteous anger. "She did it again, Harry. She came after my roses." For 40 years, Mrs. Gable had cultivated a prize-winning rose garden. It was her pride and joy. Apparently, Brenda had cited her for having bushes that were... And Harry quoted the letter. Mrs. Gable read to him, in excess of the 3-foot height regulation for perimeter foliage. The fine was $100. For Mrs. Gable, this was the final straw. It was an attack on her identity, on her history. It was pure, unadulterated cruelty. "I'm 84 years old, Harry," she said, her voice cracking. "I can't fight her, but I can't let her do this." That evening, Harry called an impromptu, quiet meeting in his garage. He invited Mrs. Gable, the Garcias, the Millers, and 2 other families who had confided in him. He laid out his binder on his workbench. He showed them the letters, the photos, the video of Brenda's car. He told them about the cut chain and the police reports. For the first time, they all saw the full scope of the harassment, not just as isolated incidents, but as a coordinated campaign by a single, malicious actor. The fear in the room was slowly replaced by a collective, simmering rage. Mr. Garcia slammed his hand on the workbench. "That woman is out of control. We have to do something. They weren't a mob. They were just decent people who had been pushed too far. They agreed to pool their resources. They would all write formal statements, notarized accounts of their own experiences with Brenda's harassment. Frank would collect them, collating them into a single, powerful portfolio of testimony. It was a turning point. Brenda thought she was fighting one stubborn old man. She had no idea she had just declared war on an entire community. The giant, as it turned out, was starting to wake up. Brenda must have sensed the shift in the neighborhood's mood. the new steel in her victims' spines. Her usual tactics of intimidation were no longer working, so she escalated, dramatically. The final threat before the fire didn't come in an envelope. It was delivered in person. Harry was on his porch, enjoying a morning coffee with Buster, when Brenda's white SUV pulled up to the curb. She didn't get out. She just rolled down her passenger side window and stared at him. "You know, Harry," she called out, her voice calm but loaded with menace. "Fire is a terrible thing, especially with these old wooden buildings. They go up so fast. A spark, a faulty wire. It would be a real tragedy if something happened to that precious family cabin of yours. A real shame." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a promise. She was talking about arson. Plain and simple. The audacity of it, the sheer, naked evil of the threat, took his breath away. Buster, sensing the tension, stood up and let out a low growl. Harry didn't respond. He just stared back at her, his face a mask of cold fury. He reached into his pocket and slowly, deliberately, pulled out his phone and hit record, making sure she saw him do it. The smug smile on her face wavered. She hadn't expected that. With a final, hateful glare, she rolled up her window and sped away. He immediately called Detective Miller. "She just threatened to burn down my cabin," he said, his voice tight. He sent Miller the video. "I heard it, Harry," Miller said grimly, but she was careful with her words. It would be a shame if a decent defense attorney would call it an expression of concern. It's not a direct threat. We can't arrest her for it. But it's the biggest brick you've laid yet. I'm putting a watch on her. And you be careful." But Harry knew being careful wasn't enough. Brenda was done with petty rules and fines. She was coming for the heart of his history, for the soul of his family. And he had a terrible sinking feeling that she was going to succeed. 2 nights later, his phone rang at 3 a.m. It was the shrill, jarring sound that always means bad news. The caller ID said, "Sheriff's Department." His blood ran cold. "Mr. Henderson?" The voice on the other end said. "This is Sergeant Peters with the County Sheriff's Office. I'm sorry to have to tell you this, but there's been a fire. A big one. At your property on Miller's Lake." The rest of the conversation was a blur. Harry threw on clothes, his mind a chaotic storm of denial and rage. He left a stunned and worried Mrs. Gable in charge of Buster and drove, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his foot heavy on the gas. He could see the glow in the sky from 5 miles away, an angry orange stain against the black star-filled canvas. He smelled it from a mile out, the acrid, sickening smell of history turning to ash. When he arrived, the scene was a chaotic nightmare of flashing red and blue lights, thick, choking smoke, and the hiss of water on superheated embers. Fire trucks crowded the narrow access road. His cabin, his grandfather's cabin, the place of 1,000 happy memories, was gone. In its place was a blackened, skeletal ruin, steam rising from its corpse. The massive stone fireplace, the one his grandfather had built with his own hands, was all that remained, standing like a tombstone in a graveyard of memories. A firefighter walked over, his face smudged with soot. "It was fully engulfed when we got here," he said, his voice full of professional sympathy. "Went up like a tinderbox. We're lucky it didn't spread to the whole forest. I'm sorry for your loss, sir. It's a total loss." Harry just stared, numb. The word loss didn't even begin to cover it. It was an amputation. Brenda had done it. She had actually done it. She had taken a piece of his soul and burned it to the ground. In the cold, grey light of dawn, the devastation was even more stark. The cabin was a charcoal husk, a gaping wound on the landscape. The smell of wet ash and burnt pine hung heavy in the air. Harry walked the perimeter with the fire marshal and Detective Miller, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. The fire marshal, a man named Chief Evans, was thorough and professional. "Initial thoughts point to an electrical fire," he said, pointing to the spot where the main power line entered the structure. "Old wiring in a place like this, it's common. A short, a spark, and this old, dry wood would go up in a hurry. It was lifters not first of his mighty wand." Harry stopped him right there. "No," he said, his voice firm, cutting through his own grief. That's impossible. He was no longer just the grieving owner. He was the expert witness. I'm a master electrical engineer. I specialized in fire safety and prevention systems for 40 years. I rewired this entire cabin myself 5 years ago. I used top-of-the-line, fire-retardant shielded cable, oversized breakers, and AFCI outlets at every point. The system I installed in this cabin was safer than the one in the county courthouse. It was not an electrical fire. His certainty, the sheer force of his professional authority, made both men pause. Miller looked at him, a new respect in his eyes. Chief Evans raised an eyebrow. Okay, Mr. Henderson, if you say so. Walk me through it. And so, amidst the ruins of his most cherished place, Harry went to work. He pointed out the burn patterns, the way the fire had clearly started on the exterior porch, far from any major electrical source. He showed them where the heat had been most intense, indicating the use of an accelerant. He was reverse engineering the crime, reading the story written in the soot and ashes. He was turning his grief into cold, hard analysis. This was his field. This was his expertise. And he was going to use it to prove, beyond any doubt, that this was not an accident. This was arson. Harry spent the next 2 days sifting through the wreckage, his hands and clothes covered in grime and soot. He was a man possessed, driven by a cold, methodical rage. Chief Evans, impressed by his expertise, had officially listed the cause of the fire as undetermined, pending further investigation, and allowed Harry, as the owner and an expert, to assist their arson investigator. Armed with his knowledge of the cabin's construction and his engineer's eye for detail, Harry found what the initial sweep had missed. Tucked away under the collapsed remnants of the porch decking, shielded from the main blaze and the firefighters' water, was a small, partially melted lump of what looked like a fire starter log, but it was too dense, too uniform. And near it, he found the faint, telltale residue of a petroleum-based accelerant, a scent he recognized from his work with industrial solvents. The official arson investigator confirmed his suspicions with a chemical test kit. It was gasoline. Someone had stacked accelerant-soaked material under the porch and lit it. This was the point of origin. This was the proof. Detective Miller was ecstatic. "This is it, Harry. This changes everything. We have physical evidence of arson. Now we just need to connect her to it." The case had transformed from a series of harassment complaints into a major felony investigation. Miller immediately got a warrant for Brenda's car and her electronic devices. The net was tightening. Harry felt a grim sense of victory, but it was overshadowed by the gaping hole in his life where the cabin used to be. The evidence was satisfying, but it wouldn't bring back the smell of old wood smoke or the feel of the sun on that porch. Justice was one thing. Restoration was another entirely. For now, he would have to settle for justice. While the police began their forensic analysis of Brenda's car and phone, Harry focused on his own investigation. He reviewed the footage from his trail cameras. The camera closest to the main road was damaged by the heat, its lens melted and warped. But the data on the SD card was intact, and it held the jackpot. At 1:48 a.m., just over an hour before the first 911 call, a figure appeared, walking down the access road toward the cabin. The image was grainy, distorted by the darkness and the infrared camera, but the person's build and gait were familiar. They were carrying a duffel bag and a gas can. A few minutes later, the same figure was seen walking quickly, almost running, back up the road, this time without the bag or the can. The final piece of the puzzle came from the one person Harry knew he could count on, Mrs. Gable. When he told her what had happened, she burst into tears. But then, through her sobs, she gave him a crucial piece of information. "Harry," she said, her voice trembling, "I couldn't sleep that night. I was up, looking out my window around 2 a.m, and I saw her. I saw Brenda's car. She was parking it down the street, not in her own driveway. She got out and walked off into the dark. I thought it was strange, but I didn't think this. It was the final link in the chain. The trail camera footage showed someone walking to the cabin. Mrs. Gable's testimony placed Brenda out of her car, on foot, at the exact same time. Detective Miller now had a witness and physical evidence. It was still circumstantial, but it was a powerful, compelling narrative of a crime. All they needed was for Brenda to make one more mistake. And Harry had a feeling that her arrogance, the very trait that started this whole mess, was about to deliver that mistake right to his doorstep. The trap was Frank's idea. It was brilliant in its simplicity and its understanding of their adversary's psychology. "She's arrogant, Harry," Frank had said. "And she's greedy. She thinks she's untouchable. She's destroyed your property. And in her twisted mind, she's the victim. She's suffered emotional distress from living near a problem neighbor. She'll feel entitled to compensation." And that led them to the insurance angle. Harry's retirement wasn't just funded by a pension. Years ago, he had co-founded a small, specialized insurance firm that catered to high-value, high-risk properties, historical homes, unique structures, exactly like his cabin. He had sold the larger company years ago but had retained ownership of the local branch as a passive investment, a small enterprise run by a trusted manager. The name of the firm was discreet: Henderson Associates, a common enough name that Brenda would never make the connection. Frank's plan was to wait. They knew Brenda would have suffered some minor incidental damage from the smoke and ash that drifted across the lake. She was a petty, vindictive woman who would absolutely try to cash in on a tragedy she herself had caused. They would let her make the first move. They had the police case building quietly in the background, but the insurance claim would be the public checkmate. It would be an undeniable act of fraud, on top of the arson. So they waited. Harry filed his own claim, of course, a painful process of cataloguing a lifetime of memories into a list of assets. He dealt with his own adjusters, setting the stage, and he watched Brenda's house from a distance, waiting for the Queen to make her final, fatal move on the chessboard he had so carefully arranged. It took 2 months. 2 agonizing months of waiting, of watching Brenda carry on as if nothing had happened. She continued her HOA patrols, though with slightly less swagger. She knew she was being watched. The police had interviewed her, and while she denied everything, the experience had clearly rattled her. But her arrogance was a powerful force. It convinced her she had gotten away with it. And then, one Tuesday morning, Frank called. "We got a bite," he said, his voice electric. "A preliminary inquiry. A woman named Brenda from the Lakewinds neighborhood. She's claiming smoke and soot damage to her lakeside gazebo and patio furniture, not to mention severe emotional trauma from the cabin fire. She's scheduled an in-person meeting for next Thursday to file the official claim." Harry felt a surge of adrenaline so powerful it made his hands shake. She had done it. She had walked right into the snare. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of it was almost unbelievable. She was going to file a fraudulent claim for damages from a fire she herself had set, and she was going to do it at a company owned by her victim. It was a level of hubris that bordered on the comical. The plan was set. The conference room at the Henderson Associates office would be the stage. The claims adjuster would set up the meeting. Frank would be there as Harry's legal counsel, and Detective Miller, officially invited to discuss the security implications of the recent arson in the area, would be the guest of honor. All the players were in position. All the evidence was catalogued and ready. The only thing left was for the star of the show to make her grand entrance. The next 48 hours were the longest of Harry's life. And so it came to be. In that cold, quiet conference room, Brenda stood there, her face a canvas of dawning horror as she processed Harry's words. "I own the place." She looked from Harry's calm, steady gaze to Frank's predatory smile, and then to the impassive face of Detective Miller. The pieces were clicking into place in her mind, forming a picture she didn't want to see. The leather briefcase suddenly seemed very heavy in her hand. This is a conflict of interest," she stammered, falling back on the bureaucratic language that had been her shield for so long. "You can't be here." Detective Miller cleared his throat. "Actually, ma'am, he can. You, on the other hand, are in a world of trouble." He gestured to the chair opposite Harry. "Why don't you have a seat, Brenda? We have a few things we'd like to discuss with you." She didn't move. She was frozen, her mind racing, searching for an exit, an angle, a loophole. But there wasn't one. The room was a hermetically sealed box of her own making. Harry spoke again, his voice still low, but now carrying the weight of righteous fury. "Before we get started, I just wanted to ask you a question, Brenda. When you were standing on my porch, with a gas can in your hand, did you feel powerful? When you struck the match and watched my family's history go up in flames, did it make you feel important?" Her face went from pale to ghostly white. It was a direct hit. He knew. He somehow knew. The mask of the HOA president, the petty tyrant, crumbled, revealing the panicked, cornered criminal underneath. Detective Miller took over, his voice the epitome of calm authority. He laid a file on the table and opened it. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The facts were a sledgehammer. "Brenda," he began. "At 1:48 a.m. on the night of the fire, a figure matching your description was recorded on a trail camera walking toward Mr. Henderson's cabin, carrying a gas can. At 2:05 a.m., the same figure was recorded, leaving in a hurry. I've come and class size, however." He slid a grainy but clear photo across the table. Brenda flinched as if it were a snake. "Furthermore," Miller continued, "we have a sworn, notarized statement from your neighbor, Martha Gable, who places you leaving your vehicle on foot at approximately the same time, walking in the direction of the lake." He added Mrs. Gable's signed statement to the photo. "Forensic analysis of your vehicle's GPS shows you driving past the access road to the cabin twice that night, shortly before the fire was reported. And our arson investigator found clear evidence of gasoline used as an accelerant at the point of origin." With each new piece of evidence, Brenda seemed to shrink in her chair. The beige pantsuit that had looked so powerful now seemed like a pathetic costume. She was drowning in a sea of meticulously collected facts. "This is a conspiracy," she finally hissed, her voice thin and reedy. "He's been harassing me, all of you. You're setting me up." Harry almost laughed. It was the classic narcissist's prayer. That didn't happen. And if it did, it wasn't that bad. And if it was, that's not a big deal. And if it is, that's not my fault. And if it was, I didn't mean it. And if I did, you deserved it. She had just hit the "you're setting me up and you deserved it" part simultaneously. Frank leaned forward, placing his own file on the table. It was thicker than Miller's. "And then there's the matter of fraud, Brenda," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "This meeting, your claim for damages from a fire that, as the evidence strongly suggests, you set yourself. Filing a fraudulent insurance claim is a federal offense, a serious one. We have your preliminary claim inquiry right here. We have the recording of your phone call setting up this meeting. You walked in here today to commit a felony. Winnie." He let that hang in the air for a moment. "And let's not forget the harassment," he continued, tapping the thick binder. "I have sworn statements from 12 of your neighbors, detailing a systematic pattern of abuse, intimidation, and misuse of your position as HOA president. Finding a widow for her rose garden, kicking a man's garden gnome. These things will not play well in front of a jury." The final blow came not from Frank or Miller, but from Harry. He slid one last thing across the table. A single, glossy photograph. It was a picture of the cabin, taken the summer before. It was beautiful, bathed in the golden light of sunset, with Buster sleeping peacefully on the porch. "This is what you took," Harry said, his voice thick with emotion for the first time. "It wasn't just wood and nails, Brenda. It was my grandfather's sweat and my father's laughter. It was my son's first fish and my wife's favorite view. You didn't just burn down a building. You burned down a library of memories. And for what? Because my mailbox was half an inch too tall?" The sheer, pathetic smallness of her motive, laid bare in that room, was the most damning evidence of all. She had nothing to say. She just stared at the photograph, and for the first time, she looked utterly and completely defeated. Detective Miller stood up. "Brenda," he said, his voice formal now, "you are under arrest for arson, insurance fraud, and multiple counts of stalking and harassment." As if on cue, a uniformed officer stepped into the room. He walked behind her chair, his hand resting on his handcuffs. The sound of the metal clicking shut echoed in the silent room. It was the sound of finality, the sound of a petty tyrant's reign coming to an abrupt and decisive end. As the officer led her away, Brenda looked back at Harry, her face a twisted mask of hatred and disbelief. "You will not get away with this," she spat, her voice cracking. Harry just looked at her. No triumph on his face, only a profound, weary sadness. "I already have, Brenda," he said quietly. "The difference is, I didn't have to break a single law to do it." He watched them lead her out of the building he owned, past the employees he paid, to face the justice system she had so arrogantly underestimated. The war was over. The monster had not only walked into the trap, but she had also helped build it, piece by piece, with every threatening letter, every late-night drive-by, and every drop of gasoline. After she was gone, the room was silent for a long moment. Frank clapped a hand on Harry's shoulder. "Well," he said with a deep sigh. "That was satisfying." Harry nodded, but his eyes were still on the photograph of the cabin. Justice was served. Now, the long, hard work of rebuilding could begin. The legal fallout for Brenda was swift and devastating. Faced with a mountain of irrefutable evidence, the video, the witness testimony, the GPS data, the forensic proof of accelerants, and the open and shut case of insurance fraud, her high-priced lawyer advised her to take a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to felony arson and fraud. The harassment charges were rolled into the deal. The sentencing hearing was a community event. The courtroom was packed with residents from the Lake Winds neighborhood. Mrs. Gable was there, sitting in the front row, looking proud and unafraid. The Garcias, the Millers, and a dozen others were there to show their support for Harry and to bear witness to the end of Brenda's tyranny. One by one, several of them gave victim impact statements. Their voices, once silenced by fear, now clear and strong as they detailed the stress and anxiety her campaign of terror had caused. Harry's statement was the last. He didn't speak of anger or revenge. He spoke of legacy, of community, and of the profound violation of having a sacred space destroyed by petty hatred. He held up the photograph of his cabin for the judge to see. When he finished, the courtroom was silent, save for Mrs. Gable's soft sobbing. Brenda was sentenced to 10 years in state prison, with a minimum of 7 to be served. The judge was unsparing in his condemnation, calling her actions a shocking display of suburban malice that escalated to a dangerous and destructive felony. As she was led away in handcuffs, for good this time, a quiet, cathartic cheer went through the people she had once terrorized. The Lake Winds HOA was thrown into chaos. A special election was called, and the entire board, tainted by their association with Brenda, was voted out. A new board was elected, led by Miss Garcia, with a new mandate, to serve the community, not rule it. The 3-ring binder of oppressive bylaws was ceremonially dropped into a recycling bin at the first meeting. The reign of the petty tyrant was officially over. The epilogue of Harry's story wasn't written in a courtroom, but on the shores of Miller's Lake, with hammers and saws, and the smell of fresh-cut lumber. The insurance money came through, covering the full replacement value of the cabin. But Harry decided not to just rebuild it exactly as it was. He would honor the past, but he would build for the future. He designed a new cabin, one that kept the spirit of his grandfather's original. The same footprint, the same massive stone fireplace which had survived the blaze like a loyal old soldier, but with modern engineering, and a few new touches. And he didn't build it alone. The story had spread, and the community, now free from Brenda's shadow, rallied around him. Mr. Garcia, who owned a construction business, offered his crew at cost. The Millers organized a schedule of volunteers. Neighbors who had been too afraid to speak up before now showed up with tool belts, sandwiches, and thermoses of coffee. Even Mrs. Gable came out one day, planting a new garden of resilient, beautiful roses near the new porch. It was a barn-raising in the truest sense of the word. They were rebuilding more than a building. They were rebuilding a community, forging bonds of friendship that were stronger than any HOA bylaw. 6 months later, the new cabin was finished. It was beautiful, a perfect blend of old and new. The original fireplace stood as the heart of the home, its stones now bearing the memory of both fire and rebirth. On a warm autumn afternoon, Harry sat on the new porch, a cup of coffee in his hand, watching the sun set over the lake. Buster was asleep at his feet, his tail thumping softly against the new deck boards. The peace he had lost had returned, deeper and more meaningful than before, because now it was a peace he had fought for, and one he had rebuilt, with the help of his friends. He had faced the fire, and from the ashes, something stronger and better had risen. Some people think they can operate above the law, using rules and intimidation to bully good people into submission. But this story proves that when a petty tyrant's arrogance pushes them to commit the ultimate crime, they often walk right into a trap of their own making. If you've ever had to deal with an out-of-control HOA or a neighborhood Karen, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of righteous revenge and justice served cold.